All right, welcome everyone. Good to see many folks joining here today. This is Mike McGrory from B-Lab Global. I'll be helping to facilitate our webinar today. Let's perhaps wait just one more minute to allow folks to join that are coming from other meetings here. While we wait, all that are attending, you're welcome to have your video up, and also welcome to place your name and where you're dialing in from and your company in the chat box, just as a way to say hello to the group. Welcome, Deanna. Thanks for starting us off on the intros.
Hi, good morning.
Deanna, yeah, we like the Zoom meeting, allowed to have faces here for our audience. All right, so we certainly have a very full agenda today and lots to share with everyone. So I'll start the introductions and context setting here and agenda, and then we'll get started with our webinar. So for those who are just joining, good to see you here. This is Mike McGrory from B-Lab Global. I'll be our facilitator today for our B Corp Climate Collective webinar titled Greenhouse Gas Baselining 101, Demystifying the Scope 1, 2, and ever elusive Scope 3 emissions. Good to see a great group joining us today. I work here at B-Lab as one of our standards analysts. So I work with companies that are interested in certifying as a B Corporation to take them through our end-to-end certification process. And I also plug in and help organize our B Corp Climate Collective. So good to see the name list here with a few familiar B Corps that I work with. All right, so let's cover a quick rundown of our agenda. So we'll have some initial context setting, followed by a brief slide from myself, just sharing our actual story here at B-Lab at measuring our own emissions. Then we'll have an overview of a tool that the B Corp Climate Collective has developed that provides a 1 to 2 hour all-in estimate that any company can use. And we'll also walk through the tool briefly, not the detailed tech platform, but just a few screenshots of the tool to get you familiar with it, which is called Greenhouse Gas Protocol Qantas tool. And then we'll finish with a few more of our Climate Collective members who are all peer-to-peer coaches who will share some of their best practices and learnings no matter where they are up the mountain. So they'll share the path forward for you all. And then we'll have about 30 minutes or so of Q&A at the end. We appreciate all the questions that folks submitted at the beginning and through their registration form. So we've collated them, and you're welcome to submit questions throughout that we'll cover during the Q&A. We do ask that, just so we get to know our audience here, that you include your name and company when submitting your emissions. I'm sorry, not emissions, your questions. Talk plenty about emissions here shortly. So good to meet you, and I'll be back with you shortly. I'll now pass to Kim Coupounas for our context setting. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's wonderful to see you all here today. Sincere thanks to the brilliant B Corp leaders you're going to hear from on this webinar. Special thanks to Rose and Karen and the B-Lab team for hosting today. It's amazing to see all of you who are on the call, and so many B Corp friends. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today. Getting a baseline of your emissions is among the most important first steps for your company in doing your part to solve the climate emergency. And obviously some of you are way down that pike and some are newer to it. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of today's webinar. But before we dig into today's content, I would like to invite everyone on the call to pause and take a deep breath together. Let's take a few moments for us to acknowledge that every community, including this one, owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought to a place against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, as my ancestors did. And some have lived in place for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. And they are essential if we are to solve the climate crisis that we are facing as a human species. So we begin this event today by acknowledging and honoring the truth. I am calling in to this webinar from within the ancestral lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho peoples. And further, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado, where I am really privileged to live. I pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the tribulations behind our many triumphant stories, including violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. I invite you to consider the land on which you live and the confluence of legacies that brought you to be where you are. I invite you to share in the chat, if you're willing, the land and the ancestral lands from which you're calling into this webinar, and to acknowledge the First Nations people of these lands. If you're not sure which ancestral lands you're on, you can find out at www.whos.land or native-land.ca, and both of those websites are on this slide. Take a moment for you all to open those websites. Thank you. And you can feel free to continue to add them into the chat. Next slide, Rose. Folks, as B Corps and as mission-driven companies, you all know that our current economic system is failing on so many dimensions, and it's creating devastating negative impacts. Slide. Next slide. Probably the most pressing one that we are here to talk about today is the climate emergency. The UN has declared that we have 12 years to prevent irreversible climate impacts and a kind of devastation that we're not really ready for yet. Next slide. The global pandemic has laid bare a multitude of inequities in the system. And so across the globe, as a result of these inequities and climate change, we're seeing massive social movements for climate justice and racial justice, and they are gaining momentum. Next slide. So the elders have shared, and so many of our leaders have shared, that climate change is the greatest existential threat of our time. Its impacts are being felt in countries and by people all across the world, and it's going to impact each and every one of us if it hasn't already. Urgent action is, if we don't take urgent action to meet the 1.5 degree target mapped out in the Paris Agreement, these effects are only going to worsen. Slide. So who's to blame for this? Most experts believe that the vast majority of impacts are caused by business. The largest corporations and those who are buying from them, meaning all of us, are largely to blame for the climate crisis. 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Slide. So the wonderful Greta Thunberg, the global climate activist, has said that our house is on fire. Let's act like it. So that's really what today's call is about. For context, the global B Corp community back in the fall of 2019, many of you were part of these conversations at our regional gatherings all around the world. We started to bring together B Corps committed to climate, and we called for B Corps to make a more aggressive commitment. We also announced at COP25 in Madrid, the B-Lab Global Network and the Global B Corp community, that we were committed to collective and immediate action to halt and reverse the current climate trajectory, and to build an inclusive, equitable, and regenerative economic system for all. Next slide. And part of those announcements, which when we share the deck afterwards, you can see all of these links, but part of that announcement was at COP25 was we announced 533 B Corps from 33 countries had committed to net zero by 2030 for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. There are now over 800 B Corps committed to net zero by 2030. It was then and is still the largest and most aggressive climate commitment to date by any group of businesses, and it's 20 years ahead of the Paris Agreement 2050 targets. Slide. So you can see on the bcorpclimatecollective.org website the details of the net zero by 2030 commitment. This is a brief summary of them. And many of you on the call are committed to net zero by 2030. Many are committed, some earlier, some later than that. wherever you are on this journey, you are welcome. Next slide. Part of the mobilization of B Corps to address the climate emergency as a unique and very credible group of businesses was to set some very bold ambitions at the beginning of this work. And it's really in three categories. One is to redefine leadership, to be pace setters for the rest of the business sector, to say what's possible in terms of how fast businesses can move in addressing the climate emergency as individual businesses and as a community. And that's what the Net Zero by 2030 commitment is all about. The second big commitment or bold ambition we've made is to drive climate action centered in justice. This is all about equipping companies for climate action, like today's webinar, building toolkits and resources that businesses can readily access and use to speed their journey to get to a zero carbon business model. And lastly is to change the rules of game, to do what we can to amplify and accelerate the transition to stakeholder governance business models, to enable businesses to have the latitude to make the kinds of decisions like B Corps do, to choose better when it comes to the climate. Next slide. So that brings us to the B Climate Tools Base, which was launched just a few weeks ago. It's an amazing collaboration between the University of Oxford and their net zero climate team with B Lab and the B Corp Climate Collective. You can find it at bcorpclimatecollective.org/tools. Next slide. And it's a free open source library of expert curated tools for taking climate action. It's got case studies, reports, it's filterable, downloadable. So no matter where you are on this journey, this is for you. It's a way for you to find the resources you need wherever you are on this climate journey. And the how of getting to a zero carbon business model is really the hardest part for most businesses. And this is a one-stop shop to find what you need. Next slide. So that brings us to, there's a group of leaders and organizations and businesses that are committed to solving the climate emergency and using the unique power of the B Corp community in the ways that are most useful and valuable at this moment in history. At the core of that group is the B Corp Climate Collective. The leaders you're going to hear from on the call today are active volunteer members of the B Corp Climate Collective. There are now regional versions of the B Corp Climate Collective all around the world. Many of them are on the call today. Welcome. Thank you for being a part of this. And now I'm going to hand the baton over to one of our amazing B Corp Climate Collective leaders, Jennifer Cooper from Native Energy.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for your leadership and inspiration and guiding us through all of this great work over the past few years and to the whole B Lab team. I want to talk for a moment about the B Corp Climate Action Group that Kim teed up. So the group formed in 2019, very early 2019, at that time led by Allgood and Alter Ego, Stonyfield, Dr. Bronner's, Cahey Method, and a few others. And at the end of that year, the group pilot tested with other B Corps and then launched a guide of tools, which Mike tells me are in the links at the end of this. Tools for B Corps to measure emissions, reduce emissions, and decarbonize business. Although everything you now need is in the tool and framework that Kim just mentioned and had up on the screen. So that was what we started off doing within the B Corp Climate Collective overall. And then in 2020, the group welcomed many, many more new B Corps to the table and turned its focus to becoming really a community of practice, peers supporting peers on the path to lower emissions and zero carbon business model. This focus came on the tails of the launch of the Net Zero by 2030 commitment, and hence the need for this focus on implementation and on supporting action and change. So today we get a close look into the community of practice on measuring emissions. So educational sessions like this one, but also coaching calls, one-on-one sessions for you, for fellow B Corps to sign up for, and a peer group that you can call upon and reach out to. Beyond the community of practice around measuring emissions, the Climate Action Group is also to be a community of practice on climate action centered in justice. So decarbonizing business, making change to our businesses that address climate and advance advance social justice. So to keep warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's known we need to transform the way we're doing business, and the infrastructure that underpins us, the way we're transporting goods, our built environment, our energy infrastructure, the agricultural practices we employ. And this is the work on climate action we will do and will center in climate justice. And this is where we aim to continue to provide support for B Corps that are leading the work, as well as B Corps just starting that work. I do want to say here that we in the Climate Action Group lean heavily on the work of other groups, the Climate Advocacy Group and the Be Engaged Employee Engagement Group, also in the Climate Collective, as many of the smaller B Corps can really make their largest waves via advocacy and engagement on climate. So that's included in what we look at in the Climate Action Group. Lastly, allow me to remind everyone the group is always open to new B Corps, so welcome all, as Kim said, no matter where you are along the journey. And now let's turn the focus back to measuring emissions and the reason we're here today. And we can lean on Mike to talk about the importance of knowing our own emissions baseline.
Thanks, Kim and Jennifer. And I do get excited when I see a lot of committees and subcommittees, because I've learned through my organizing over the years that that's actually a great sign that the movement is coalescing and getting organized. And I think that's a sign of the boots on the ground work starting to happen. So appreciate the context there. Wanted to briefly just share B Lab's own story with utilizing the methodology that we're going to walk through today. When I arrived in 2016 or so, we were measuring mainly our flights, and we were spending about 8 hours per quarter measuring each individual flight and calculating the miles and emissions for each one. When I joined the Climate Collective, I became aware of the Qantas tool that we'll talk through today and the methodology, and I was able to help our team change to that methodology. And now we spend about 15 minutes per quarter, and our emissions that we're capturing are 10 times larger. So we were at about 270 tons of emissions. Now we're estimating 2,700 tons in a fraction of the time. So it's definitely been a boost to our work. And we were able to use that to increase our carbon price budget by 40% the last 2 years based on that new data. And that budget's used for reduction projects, for offsets that are third-party verified, and for community tree planting projects. So we recently donated to the Philly Orchard Project that plants orchards in food deserts within Philadelphia. And I can attest that they were very surprised to see the increased donation arrive. So this step is so critical to putting a price on carbon and beginning the work, because we don't have too long to get to net zero. I've worked with this tool through a few of my B Corps, and we found that we've piloted it. Hold on, I'll pause here. I think our slides might have dropped there. Are you seeing that too? I see some head nods. So just wanted to note that.
One sec here.
No worries. Luckily, we have a bit of cushion built in for the agenda, but I can share, I can share our story here shortly. Awesome. Thanks, Karen. Appreciate it. I think we're back one just very briefly. Awesome. So so we increased our carbon budget by 40%, which had major impact locally. I've worked with B Corps large and small who've piloted the technique today that we'll talk through, and it's been valuable from what I can perceive to those that are even far down the path. Just to have a second angle on your back of the envelope emissions has been very enlightening. Some B Corps have discovered that their emissions might be about 5 to 10 times higher as well. And you get a picture of the forest so that we make sure we have an all-in calculation. So hopefully, no matter where you are in the journey, you get value in this method we'll talk through today. And lastly, I just wanted to confirm that this has been reviewed by the B Lab standards team and is eligible for credit if you arrive at your recertification, for those that are B Corps on the call, you would get credit in the monitoring greenhouse gas emissions just with this question. And if you were to buy offsets or reductions based on this tool, those would also be eligible for credit in the assessment and sufficient to reach your net zero by 2030 commitment. So very excited about that. And yeah, now let's roll up our sleeves a bit, and we'll pass on to Henkel to give us the overview of our tool and how to get ready to do that estimate.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for the overview. So our measure committee has three main objectives. The first one is helping net zero 2030 signatories gain an awareness of how and where their business creates emissions. Through that process, we're trying to help identify hotspots where you can take near-term actions that aren't disruptive to your business. So start making an immediate impact. And the third thing is helping signatories align their emissions accounting with the world's most widely used standard, which is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So to make sure everyone here today has a baseline familiarity with this standard, let's take a quick look at how the Greenhouse Gas Protocol categorizes different emissions into different scopes. In general, visualizing and documenting all the things that make your business possible is a very helpful exercise. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol takes this approach. That's what you see on this graphic. And so let's dive into it just really briefly. As you can see, there's three scopes here, 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 will be the emissions that you have direct control over. So if you have a fleet of vehicles, if you have your own equipment that you run in a factory, whatever that might be, those would be examples of Scope 1. Scope 2 emissions are going to be any emissions related to energy that you purchase from the grid. And then Scope 3 emissions are going to be everything else that makes your business possible. So if this is all new to you, this might seem like a daunting task. Again, the measure committee is focused on helping you simplify and get started with an emissions inventory. So a main focus of ours has been selecting a measurement tool that will be useful in helping you complete your first screening of your company's carbon emissions. There's a number of great measurement tools available online. For the intents and purposes of our committee, we recommend the Qantas Scope 3 Evaluator. So if you can just go to the next slide, please. It's not uncommon for a business to have 80% or more of their emissions come from Scope 3. Again, those are things that are not in your direct control, and they're not coming from the grid energy that you're purchasing. So the reasons we're choosing this tool, or we've chosen this tool, is number one, it covers scopes 1 and 2, and it simplifies the data gathering for Scope 3 emissions. Its structured output is based on the GHG protocol's 15 Scope 3 categories, just like you saw in the last slide. It was developed in partnership with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it's aligned with the World Resources Institute. Again, both organizations recognized as authorities, let's say, in the emission space. It's based on world input, output, and OpenIO databases, as well as the US Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's flexible. It's built for convenience. You can enter in actual data if you have access to that actual data. Examples would be energy bills, or as Mike was just mentioning, any specific flight details you have for business travel throughout the year. And then finally, it's vendor neutral. It's online, it's free for public use. And so with all that, I'm gonna hand things over to Pancho with All Good, and he can walk you through some details and show you some specific screens of the tool.
Thanks, Henkel. Yeah, so as Henkel said, we're gonna be focusing on the Qantas Evaluator. It is a broad strokes, high level estimation tool. There are definitely a lot of other tools and services out there that would allow you to dig in and drill down. But this is a really great place to start. If you just want to know, establish a baseline of what is, my ballpark carbon footprint. Qantas is a great tool. So Getting started is really straightforward and easy. You can create a login and you're pretty much set to begin from there. The information you're going to need is also fairly straightforward. And, if there's anything that you don't have once you get started, it's, the tool will save your progress as long as you're logged in. And then, you can go and collect that information from whoever on your team has it, and you can circle back and finish your estimation process. So if we go to the next slide. And so here are a couple of examples of some of the screens you'll see as you make your way through the tool. Questions about your owned and operated facilities to cover scope 1 and 2, as Henkel mentioned, that's the assets that you have within, so to speak, your 4 walls, and then the electricity you're using. Also, if there are a couple of places like the very first question, if you've already calculated scope 1 and 2 elsewhere, and you have that carbon footprint data and you want to bring it into the estimator, you can include it here. So beyond that, utility bills would be good to have, an understanding for other fuels consumed in your operations. That's if you own your own transportation fleets, or if you have a warehouse with forklifts and you're using propane in those forklifts, whatever it may be. And then also moving into scope 3, the screenshot on the right would be where you would enter your purchase goods and services. So the tool has a variety of different kind of high-level broad strokes categories that you can categorize your purchased goods and services over the course of the year, and then provide the spend data from that. So for example, all goods, kind of the high level ones were manufacturing, machinery, rubber and plastics, and other. So those are the 4 categories that, as I got a quick estimate with the Qantas tool, I entered. And on to the next slide. And so here's 2 more screenshots of examples of information you might have. So third-party transport, we have a few different ways of aggregating, how we transport our shipments. So it was nice to be able to enter those in separately by expense data again. And then business travel, we actually have a tool that allows us to calculate the air miles from all of our flights exactly, just using airport codes. So that was, it was convenient to be able to enter the exact number of air miles we had. And then, talked briefly with our finance team, and they gave me some rough estimates for, hotel room and taxi expenses that we incurred at the beginning of 2020 before everybody went into lockdown. So I was able to enter those as well. If you have business travel emissions calculated somehow, you can enter them here as well. And on to the next slide. And so yeah, once you've entered everything, you would just navigate to the results tab in the Qantas tool, and it would give you an output of what it estimates your footprint is. So this is the estimate for all goods 2020 footprint. And so yeah, we recommend as the text on the left says, hold on to this information. It'll be helpful in the BIA assessment if you haven't estimated your footprint elsewhere. That way you can enter it, and as it's accepted in the BIA as a valid estimate of your company's carbon footprint. So as we've mentioned a couple of times, there are other tools out there. For example, Climate Neutral or South Pole are tools that you may have heard about that would also allow you to calculate a high-level baseline carbon footprint. And then, if you want to drill down and go deeper, you can do that with some of the other tools out there. So for example, if I knew, okay, our category 1 purchase goods and services, I can run a bill of materials report for everything that we've purchased. Then some of the other tools out there, you'd be able to drill down and dig in. So it really just depends, the tool that you end up using, on what data you have, and which of the tools is best suited for your company, your needs, the information that is most readily available. The philosophy there is definitely to do something, to get started, And then, if you want to refine, if you want to drill down later, then that's great too. But to just have this number and to be able to move forward with it is a great first step. So yeah, and then beyond that, beyond just kind of the tools that are available to you, you could also, consider working with a consultancy. There are a lot of consultants out there that will provide, even more granular services, and you can understand your product's footprint at, the individual SKU level. For example, I know Allbirds has done that, and I think that's really cool. So yeah, with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on, I believe, to Eileen from Allbirds.
Great, thanks, Pancho. It was great to walk through all of that. Hi, everyone. I'm Eileen, and I'm on the sustainability team at Allbirds. I'll let Jack and Kevin also briefly introduce themselves before we dive into sharing a few best practices.
Good afternoon, guys. I'm Jack. I'm with Shandos Construction and kind of leading our internal greenhouse gas reduction strategies here.
Everyone, my name is Kevin Lee, and I am with Dr. Bronner's, and I help measure our environmental footprint at the company, and very glad to be here today to share our stories and experiences calculating our greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. So diving in, we all just got, a big detailed intro of that Qantas tool, and we just wanted to follow up with a few best practices and learnings that we've all experienced while working through this at our own organizations. So the first one I'll touch on is just getting started. And this might seem obvious, but really that is the first step, is just to dive right in. And if measuring carbon emissions is a new exercise for your company, it can feel intimidating and lots of pieces of information, but it's really important to recognize that this is a journey that we're all on, and we really need to get started. And yeah, like I said, Pancho gave a great overview of the Qantas tool, which is one example of a free tool that can help you get started, but also, as you develop that initial baseline of your emissions, it can be really helpful to find and lean on experts to help you focus on the details of your high emissions areas. And it's also really valuable to reference tools that are used in your sector, in your industry, where you can gain additional insights and develop an understanding of your own industry's best practices. So for example, at Allbirds, we started our carbon measurement journey, and it quickly became clear that the majority of our emissions are associated with the products that we make, footwear and apparel. So with the help of consultants, we developed a life cycle assessment tool to calculate the carbon footprint of each footwear and apparel item in order to start getting a really detailed understanding of where we could start driving carbon reductions on a product level. And we also lean on key resources in our industry, looking to organizations like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition or Textile Exchange, B Corp, and making sure that we're building our understanding of the industry and how we can all collaborate to work towards carbon reductions. So yeah, just kind of summarizing that, it's important to get started, start doing this baselining, and there's a journey ahead, but there's a lot of learning and collaboration on that journey that's really exciting. And now I'll pass it off to Jack to share some more of his best practices around identifying hotspots.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Shailene. Great information on how to get started. And it's true. You just have to dive right in and really begin to really understand where you are and how to go. So, and the baseline estimate is really designed to help you get started with tracking and understanding your sources. It's going to give you a great general idea of where your emissions are coming from. And that allows you to identify reduction strategies or determine what emission sources you want to dive deeper into to really understand and allow you to build a more detailed inventory. That's typically with the help of a consultant at that point. And this is important because it's very easy to go down the rabbit hole of perfection for something that might only contribute to 1% of your overall emissions. So it's definitely a time versus value comparison there. And for Shandos, we're a construction manager, and our initial baseline indicated that fuel and electricity sources were going to be some of our largest emissions throughout the company. So this allowed us to dedicate most of our time to fully understand and track all of our diesel, propane, electricity use on all of our sites. And this is to ensure that they were as accurate as possible. Now, if we were going to go to the same level of depth on everything, like spending 8 hours a quarter on tracking our flights, we could easily get stuck in information paralysis. So it's definitely beneficial to know where your sources are and then focus and making sure that they're basically as accurate as possible. And then you also want to identify where your organization has control or influence in their emission sources. And by understanding your degree of influence with your suppliers, manufacturers, or other stakeholders, both upstream and downstream in your value chain, you can really determine what sources you should be focusing on. Now, this isn't static, and as you gain a better understanding of your emissions and gain influence in the value chain, you can always refine your inventory. And again, another example from Shandos is we determined to omit our subtrade emissions, which would fall under scope 3 emissions. And this is because most of the time we have little control in their offsite operations. And this would result in huge tracking undertaking, but provide little value in reducing our overall footprint. Instead, we are focused on site level activities like waste, gas, electricity. And through that, we're going to influence our subtrades and hopefully inspire them to track their own greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I'm going to pass that over to Kevin.
Thanks, Jack. I'm remembering now that I forgot to kind of do a better intro of Dr. Bronner's. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Bronner's, we're a personal care products brand, and we're most known for our peppermint soaps, and we're also organic and fair trade company. And I wanted to mention that because to kind of paint the picture, Dr. Bronner's has been engaged in regenerative organic agriculture for a while. We have incorporated dynamic agroforestry and organic and fair trade practices along our supply chains for some time now. And so we kind of just, as a company, oftentimes just dive right into practices that we know are generally better. And when it came to understanding the impacts of our greenhouse gas, of our carbon footprint in our supply chain, we hadn't measured our greenhouse gases before adopting these practices. And so for us, we engaged on this journey to measure our greenhouse gas emissions because we eventually wanted to understand our impact using this sort of quasi-measurable way. And so we decided to use Qantas, and as the other companies have mentioned, it's just a really great and easy way to get started. But as we started to use Qantas, we noticed that our scope 3 category 1 emissions, purchased goods and services, were really high. And of course, that does reflect our general practices. But as we were embarking on this journey, we were asking, we realized it was an iterative process, and we were asking questions in parallel. For example, are the numbers accurate? We do so much work in our regenerative supply chains that we felt like the Qantas tool was not an accurate reflection of our actual practices. But that said, it's a great tool to get started. And as Jack mentioned, like once you do those baseline calculations, you can start to work with consultants and use other tools that fit your company. So Qantas is a great tool to use since it uses financial data, and most companies have financial data. And for us, once we started using Qantas, then we used a tool that would allow us to input mass-based numbers and calculations. Ironically, as we began to dig deeper into the details, we realized that measuring greenhouse gas emissions is more of an art than a science. But that shouldn't be a deterrent. I think it's still really important to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. But just know that as you dig deeper, sometimes you begin to realize there's a lot of nuance and gray areas, and that's okay. We often say it's more of an art than a science. Something that we realized as we dug into the details was that a lot of the tools that we use, including Qantas, makes a lot of assumptions. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, you can start working with your suppliers. And that's what we did in this past year. We sent out surveys to our co-manufacturers, our co-packers, to get more accurate numbers for our Scope 3 emissions. And what we found along the way was that it started conversations with other companies about how they could also start measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. So, if we're going to get to net zero as an entire community and really work on this climate issue, it can't just be one company or a few companies. We really need to grow this community. So we found that embarking on Scope 3 emissions for Dr. Bronner's was a way to get people and other companies to start measuring their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And hopefully they can start measuring their Scope 3 emissions as well. Just a pro tip, we have found that having direct relationships with our raw material suppliers has helped us get better, more accurate numbers. As I mentioned, Dr. Bronner's, we've been a fair trade organic company and we have sister companies along our supply chain. So from the start, we've been built to be able to work directly with our raw material suppliers. But I just wanted to mention that because if you are not working directly with the raw material suppliers, measuring your greenhouse gas emissions might be a way to start doing that. We have found really wonderful things come out of direct relationships. So just wanted to mention that. And I think I will stop there and pass it on to, I believe, back to Kim.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Amazing brilliance from all of these incredible practitioners from within the community. Thank you for your leadership. So as you heard over the last bit of time, the devil's in the details. This is really essential that you start here in terms of getting on the journey to decarbonizing your business model. And I also want to say that as Dr. Alonda Williams, our Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at B-Lab says, it's about the people, y'all. Next slide. There's a fantastic quote from a civil rights activist, Audre Lorde. And Rose, I'll have you change the slide. That says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Climate change, climate action, climate advocacy, that is a great example of, a issue area where we can really think it's about the carbon in the atmosphere. It's about the carbon in the atmosphere, absolutely. It's about measuring our greenhouse gas footprint and figuring out how to reduce it. And it's also about the way that climate change is impacting real people with lived experience every single day. Next slide. And if you already tuned into climate justice, you're well aware that the thing that about climate change is that its impacts are impacting people differently and in profoundly unjust ways. Climate change is profoundly unjust in the way that it's showing up on our planet. From the degree of responsibility, those who bear the least responsibility for climate change are the ones who are feeling it and suffering the most, to the way that it's impacting lower income regions of the world, to the way that it's impacting communities and nations and places around the world that have the least capacity to deal with those impacts, to the intergenerational impacts that it's having. Our youth are going to unfortunately inherit quite a mess from us, and it's going to be obviously worse than their parents and their grandparents. And then there's massive gender disparity in terms of how climate change is impacting people. Next slide. So climate justice, which I think is an elusive term to a lot of people, especially folks that might have come to the climate action realm from a more scientific background or focused on like the nuts and bolts of how to remove greenhouse gases from how you produce things and the way you operate your businesses. But climate justice focuses not just on the carbon, but it's really about people. It's linking climate action and advocacy to human rights and development. It's taking a very human-centered approach to climate action, and it's targeting the most vulnerable people within our communities and the stakeholders that we impact. Next slide. So back at, I think you all are probably familiar with the way that the original B Corp community came together to address the climate emergency was back at a leadership conference that we had in 2019 in Taos Ski Valley, which is a certified B Corp, an amazing place if you haven't been there in New Mexico. And at the 2020 version of that summit, we really asked the hard question, how do we center climate justice in all of the B Corp climate work that we're doing? Next slide. And coming out of that question was the launch of the Climate Justice Learning Task Force, which is led by Raj Agarwal and was originally led by Alonda Williams. And that evolved into the creation of our very first, version 1 of the Climate Justice Playbook for Business. Next slide. It is an incredible resource for you. Embedded within this playbook is a global call for businesses to center all climate action in people and in justice. It's not a checklist, it's really more of a landscape analysis. This first foray into this realm is guidance for business leaders who are seeking to understand what climate justice means, which is elusive, as I said. And for those companies who want to advance climate justice as they're doing the hard work of climate action. It includes insights from over 40 B Corps and some deeper case studies from 4 specific B Corps, and you'll see that when you download the playbook. It's for all of you, no matter where you are on this journey. Please download the playbook and kind of marinate in it. These are hard questions, it's hard work. I know that greenhouse gas assessments and decarbonization is hard work too, and they have to be done in concert. Next slide. These are the partners that were involved in producing the Climate Justice Playbook, B-Lab and the B Corp Climate Collective, obviously. Our partners at the Said Business School at Oxford University, the Race to Zero team at the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Change Group, and Provoke, which is a certified B Corp led by Raj Agarwal. And then these are the amazing B Corps that were a part of this project. Next slide. So one of the fundamental aspects that you'll see in the playbook is that doing the hard work of climate justice requires making a fundamental mindset shift from extractive and exploitative old power models and mindsets that are perpetuating a cycle of harm and injustice to people to more equitable and regenerative mindsets that are rooted in new power models that are creating a sustainable social and environmental future for our species. Next slide. So the one thing I'd encourage you all as people who are doing the deep and hard work within your companies is to really challenge some flawed notions. I think for a long time, and it's kind of one of the reasons that a lot of climate work over the last 50 years has failed, is this belief that we have to focus on carbon. To believe that you can only work on climate action or climate justice is really a false choice. Next slide. There's a fantastic climate activist named Sam Grant, who's part of 350.org, and he says, it's not choosing this or that, it's this, then, or this, then that. It's really about this and that. Next slide. And the amazing folks at Equitable and Just Climate have said the defining environmental crisis of our time, which is climate change, demands an urgency to act. That's why you're all in this webinar today. And yet this urgency must not displace or abandon the fundamental principles of democracy and justice. Next slide. So how do you do that? My recommendation to you as business leaders is the first and best place for you to start by downloading and reading the Climate Justice Playbook for Business. Next slide. And now I'll pass it back to Mike and Jennifer.
Thank you, Kim. And as we shared before, you know, with climate justice, having a price on carbon and a budget is a key step to enacting and executing on that change that we'd all like to see in the world. So hopefully today we've covered a very simple way that this group can, within a few hours, gather their all-in estimate and then take the next step of setting a budget on that in a multi-year plan to reach net zero by 2030, which will have change along the way with every step and every relationship completed, just like we at B-Lab have worked with our local Philly Orchard project. And certainly in the future, we got a few questions early on through the registration about net zero paths forward, and that will definitely be our very next focus. You know, now that we've helped this whole group and the community take the first step, certainly we'll be following with future resources and presentations on now that we have our baseline, how can we set that plan towards net zero by 2030. So just a few specific suggested next actions. Certainly recommend trying your hand at a high level baseline. We have created a guide that will step-by-step walk you through that 2-hour estimate or less in Qantas. So we'll be sending this presentation out afterwards, and all of the links you see here will be in an email for you all to review. Would welcome any members of this call that aren't yet on the B Corp Climate Collective or haven't made the net zero by 2030 commitment. We'd love to have you as part of that commitment. And as always, we want to make sure we have the climate justice lens in every communication and every step we take. And we have our link to our guide there. For US and Canadian B Corps, we welcome you to submit our coaching call form. So all of the presenters today were coaches that can serve as a peer-to-peer mentor for you and are happy to and available to schedule a call for your specific questions, whether it's about baselining or maybe the more advanced next steps around insetting and reductions and offsetting. So we're available. Encourage you to submit the form there. And then for those on the call that are outside of the US and Canada that are B Corps, we recommend submitting a post to the Beehive page, which is our social media platform, the B Corp Climate Collective page. And there's many consultants and other B Corps that have been jumping in to help out there. For folks that aren't certified as B Corps, we will have a climate email that you can also reach out to for ways to engage. So be on the lookout certainly for future events. All on our list will be communicated about those future events. And then some of the past resources that we created are our climate action emissions guide. So there's a link there, and then there's a whole plethora of other resources for the group on our official tools page that we created with many collaborative partners. It's kind of a central hub, a one-stop shop for resources. We'll also follow up afterwards with a brief feedback form. Would love to hear your input on how the webinar went today, and if you had input or feedback on how we could improve. So that's we can go that's our formal coverage of our content, and now we'll cover some Q&A. I welcome some more submissions if you all would like to add your questions and answers, and we'll follow up with some answers here live as you submit them. We also gathered quite a bit of questions upon registration, so I've gathered them into the most frequent ones that we can ask to the group. So yeah, Rose, we can hang on here for our Q&A, and so let's start the discussion. One of the highest, most frequent questions we had was about capturing the emissions from work from home employees. And I wanted to make sure we spent a little bit of time talking through that with our coaches. So I thought Pablo would be a good person to kick us off here. He's another one of our coaches that have recently joined the Climate Action Group. Pablo, if you're available, would you like to talk through any tips you have for capturing work from home impact?
Yeah, this is Pablo Pastor with South Pole and a member of the coaching team. So it depends on the size of your organization. Obviously, if you just have a few people, you can dig right into utility bill data with those people and come up with an estimate of what percentage of their home energy use is for business activities. You could also look at the energy consumed by their computer and lighting and router and things like that. When you get more people in the organization, that becomes less feasible. So one way of doing it is by finding an estimation methodology out there, which I'm sure exists this year. I personally haven't worked with them or looked for them. Another way is a survey that is sent out to your employees and is sort of extrapolated based on the percentage of responses you get, just assuming that everyone that didn't respond has a similar work at home energy use and footprint as those that did respond. And for tools, we typically use a Google tool I'm forgetting what they call it, but it's a Google tool for doing surveys. You can build them and then you can capture all of the data in a Google Sheet for further analysis. And some of the questions you might ask is, how much, like what percentage of your home energy use is used for business, or you could get more specific. You could have people look at their computer's power supply and tell you how many watts it is. And then you could assume for an 8-hour workday times that many watts, that tells you how many kilowatt hours they're using for the day. You can ask some questions around how many lights they turn on in their office and things like that. But it's really going to depend on the specific business and work from home situation.
Awesome, thanks, Pablo. And I can also confirm that Qantas will accept kilowatt hours or utilities spend data independent of so whatever you capture on your survey, Qantas will accept that. Let's go to one from the live chat here. We had one from Kainoa to everyone about the coaching calls. Yes, Kainoa, if you are working on the impact assessment but not yet certified, you're certainly welcome to submit the form for a coaching call. So happy to connect with you. And then another quick one from Aaron regarding how B-Lab verifies the emissions for our partnership with the Philly Orchard Project. At the moment, we use our own modeled assumptions of certain dollar amounts converting to tree plantings, which we then convert to carbon on our own. So as part of the net zero by 2030 commitment, we recommend using third-party verified offsets, but it's not required for every portion of your offset budget. So we like to diversify with third-party offsets, reductions, and then also just grassroots projects in the community. So let's see, one of the other frequent questions we had was around how can subcontractor emissions be captured for third-party manufacturers. And I know we've had discussions in the past, Pancho and Kevin, I believe you both use third party, so I thought I'd direct it your way, but feel free to pass it back and we can open it up to the group.
So one part of that question was, how do you capture emissions from third-party manufacturers? And that was kind of what I was mentioning towards the end of my section, that we first started off with Qantas and they make assumptions. So Qantas does take into account emissions from third-party companies that you may work with. And so when we wanted to dig into the details and get better numbers, we decided to send surveys out, and it can be a simple survey, Google form or whatever format, SurveyMonkey, just to get their scopes 1 and 2 emissions, because their scopes 1 and 2 emissions are your scope 3 emissions.
So yeah, we tried to encourage erring on the side of including those scope 3s to account for the whole supply chain. So appreciate that, Kevin.
Yeah, and then in terms of All Good, we are a third-party contract manufacturer heavy operation. So it's definitely a question that's relevant to us. Unlike Dr. Bronner's, we don't quite yet have the clout to vertically integrate, and with some of our co-manufacturing partners, we don't have the ability to ask them for this kind of information and expect them to get back to us within a reasonable time frame. We're just not as big, right? So I think it really depends on how much sway you have and whether you can throw your weight around to get that kind of information. What we've ended up doing is using a tool that does allow us to drill down into the estimates that we received, kind of our top level estimates, and we can refine the kind of the assumptions that the tool has made in a second step. So that allows us to say, okay, well, all of our packaging that is plastic is recycled plastic, right? And so that changes the kind of the footprint estimate that the tool initially generated. Or to say, okay, well, all of our manufacturing and all of our third-party operations are US based. Again, that changes things because you're not dealing with overseas shipping and things of that nature. So yeah, that's definitely one way to drill down if you don't necessarily have the clout or the resources to do, you know, a much more detailed dive like Dr. Bronner's has done. So again, yeah, it really just depends on, you know, what is available to you and to your company, given, you know, your resources and kind of the time and money you can throw at the estimation, and then from there you can go with. Most of these tools have, you know, some really good data to them, so we found that across tools, the estimates are fairly consistent, and that's reassuring.
Thanks, Pancho and Kevin there. So I'll move over to the chat here. Thanks for the questions all. I did see a question asking if the Qantas tool is ISO compliant. I know it was developed with the greenhouse gas protocol, which is affiliated with the UN. Any of our speakers aware of that one? We might have to follow up.
So Mike, I just replied to that. Again, the intent of this tool is to provide you a convenient way to obtain a first pass inventory of your emissions. If you have a requirement for ISO certification, or if that's something you're trying to obtain, my position, and I'm sure everyone here would share this, is work with a consultant that can get you there. You know, this tool really is powerful to the extent that it is. It's not an end all be all. It's very useful to getting, you know, what we've been presenting today as far as that initial pass. But I would not take this and then try to apply it to an ISO certification.
Thanks, Henkel. I've noted that as well, to dig into the source for Qantas there, just to have that. I should mention also that we've had lots of questions that came through our registration, so we are organizing those. So if you don't hear your question today, we will be working towards a FAQ or a resource for folks. Really good insights came through there. And I saw a couple questions around will this tool be applicable for European companies or global companies? And is there other options that are more market specific? I do know that, just speaking on behalf on the B-Lab standards team, that B corporations that are submitting data from Qantas in Europe, B-Lab Europe or global regions, all would be eligible for credit within our assessment. So I can at least share that. There might need to be conversions if you're using dollars data from a currency standpoint, but again, at the high level, we feel confident that that estimate would be very insightful. So do recommend trying that out. And I believe they're on the Climate Collective Beehive page. There are a few links that have been sent out to tools. So I recommend submitting the question there as well. And I think we'll get some good responses. Appreciate the question there. So let's see what we had here from the frequently asked questions early on. One that popped up before and during the talk today was around using 2020 as a baseline year. So I thought I'd open that up to the full group of panelists, see if you all have thought that through or have a guidance to folks around using 2020 as a baseline year, especially for reductions work.
I think I could add to that a little bit. So with Shandos, we have our 2019 as our baseline, and we finished our 2020, and we noticed that without doing anything, our emissions dropped by about 20 to 25%. So I would not recommend using 2020 as a baseline, or you're going to see that your emissions kind of, once we get back to business as normal or semi back to what it used to be, then you're going to see your emissions rise. So I would definitely recommend using 2019 information.
Appreciate that, Jack. And any others, their experience?
Yeah, I can add on a bit to that. I think also, yeah, I mean, I think 2020 for many of the different scopes of emissions, it could be skewed. You know, for example, if normally employees are in the office and they weren't in the office in 2020 or not taking as many flights. But there also could be the possibility that some of your scope categories are similar to 2019 or years before 2020. You know, if in cases where you were selling a similar number of products, or certain aspects of your business did operate in a similar way. So, I mean, I probably agree that on the whole, it's likely a little bit skewed, but there might be some of the scope categories that are comparable to what we would consider like a standard year.
Appreciate that. And yeah, I can share, the UN has a great website that gives us the target we need to hit in reductions. And the last time I checked, it was about 8% per year reduction between now and 2030. So if we're using 2020 as a baseline, then it would be 8% off of that value. So you could do a smoothed out average, but nonetheless, it's tremendous, 8%. With COVID worldwide, The Guardian reported we were at a 5% reduction in 2020 globally. So certainly gives us perspective of the magnitude of reduction left ahead. Very humbling numbers. All right, let's see here.
Got just a quick one to add on to that. We interestingly saw talking in terms of carbon intensity, right? So tons of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent gases. Our 2020 numbers went up compared to our 2019 numbers. And so we were kind of in an interesting situation where we had to scramble to start pumping out as much hand sanitizer as we possibly could. And that meant a lot of air freight that we normally would have shipped by truck. And, they're, kind of weird things that we wouldn't normally do. So what it was for us was a really great insight into what would happen if, instead of taking steps and actions to reduce our footprint, if we started to relax, kind of our protocols around doing things in a way that is gonna, keep our emissions low. So that's been really interesting. And in that sense, we can take that and share with the team, with our operations team. Okay, well, these 9 air freight shipments have the same carbon footprint as these 500 ground shipments. And, this is why we need to focus on continuing to ship ground instead of shipping air, or stuff like that. So just wanted to share that perspective.
Awesome. And while we're on the topic of reductions too, I thought we'd be interesting while we have this experienced group to see if you could share maybe that next step that you've taken on the journey around reductions. So any of our panelists, is there a reductions win that you recall in terms of a project or a hotspot that you found and a way you were able to reduce your emissions that might be of insight for the group here, just to prime us for what to look for? And we'll give them a moment to think. I'm putting folks on the spot here, so.
I think you're muted, Pablo.
Yeah, thank you. Got a quick example from a client that I worked with years ago. They're in the food manufacturing space, and they had a contract manufacturer down in LA, and their warehouse was in Reno. But about 20% of their product was being sold to Amazon, Walmart, Target, and so on. And they all had distribution centers in LA. So they were basically trucking everything to Reno. putting it on different trucks and driving 20% of it back to LA. So that was one of the low-hanging fruit items that we identified, and they moved their distribution center to be about 2 or 3 miles from their contract manufacturing facility and cut out tons and tons of emissions.
Awesome. And we love when at B-Lab when environmental or social projects align with economic wins, which happens quite often, which is a good sign. Any other reduction projects popping up or insetting wins?
I guess one of the wins that we recently had. So after completing our 2020 inventory, we compared our 2019 and 2020 at the leadership conference with basically all of the employees, all of Chandos, and did a 20-minute reduction kind of roundtable strategy for people to suggest reductions that they want. And one thing that we noticed is that there's just as much visual importance on reductions as there are actual impactful exercises. So a lot of people like to see the flashy sustainability type reductions within the company, and that helps motivate them to really focus and buy into the kind of bigger, more expensive, and also more impactful reductions that you're going to try and implement. So definitely embrace your entire teams to really get the most benefit and reduction possible.
Awesome, Jack. And yeah, as folks go along, feel free to weave in examples for reductions as we answer some more questions here. Appreciate the great interest. Let's see here. So we had a question around just additional tools. So as we mentioned, this Qantas tool is a great first step. And I know that folks dive into the details with many tools and kind of piece it together to get a more accurate second level view. Jennifer, I recalled you had listed a few tools for us during our different discussions. So I thought I'd see if there were a few that come to mind that folks could use if they're interested in taking that next step. And then we'll open it up to the group.
Yeah, there's another tool, again, on the simple getting started from Berkeley, and I'm forgetting the name, but I'll check it and send the link in the chat, which helps with basic estimates for some of the key sources of emissions. I know it's interesting to point out that a lot of the B Corps have used more than one tool to piece together different aspects of emissions. Some are better at certain sources, capturing certain sources than others. And I think this Berkeley one is great on a number of fronts, and then falls short if you have, not in 2020, but in previous times, lots of flights. It sort of caps you out at how many flights you can put in. So there's a fall down there. So when you're sort of piecing together, when you're looking to use free tools to get an initial estimate, it's helpful sometimes to piece a few of them together to get that full picture. And I'll add the link to that one.
Appreciate it, Jennifer. Yeah, no, and within the guide in our next steps, certainly a good list of that next level there. Any other tools from the group? I think Pancho, you had mentioned one of interest, or any other panelists?
Yeah. So we use a tool called the Brand Emissions Estimator, put together by a nonprofit called Climate Neutral. And it is one of those tools where you kind of have two levels of estimation. You have the first level of estimation where you're giving the tool really high level, it's basically top line expenses across the board, and then saying, you know, in what countries those expenses are being incurred, and it gives you, and what industry you're in. And with those three pieces of information, it'll give you an estimate and break it out across the different sectors that Henkel explained. And then from there, you're able to drill down into each of those estimates and say, kind of like I was saying, you know, well, we know what the bill of materials is for each of our SKUs, so we can using the bill of materials and how many SKUs we sold, or I guess manufactured over the course of that year, we can say, okay, well, this estimate needs to get tweaked. We didn't use any of this kind of fuel, but we used this fuel instead, or we didn't use any of kind of this plastic, but we used this other plastic instead. And so that allows you to kind of hone it in. Interestingly, the estimate, though, kind of, where the footprint is heavy, shifts a little bit. Once you refine, the estimate is still pretty accurate. And then Pablo, I think the South Pole tool is, from what I've seen, I haven't explored it too much, but I think it's really similar to the climate neutral tool, and may be a better fit for people, just depending on, what information it's asking for and what information they have, or, some other points of differentiation.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with their tool, unfortunately, but I encourage anyone to explore both or all three, and find the best fit.
And we've been, as a committee on our Wednesday meetings, are often comparing the results. So we ask everyone to input into multiple tools so that we can calibrate. You'll see these days 10 to 20% variance, we found at least, but directionally they're all much bigger than perhaps a very narrow view. So even if they are slightly off, we're getting the whole forest there. And the forests are generally pretty close versus just one tree's detailed data. So we've been encouraged that some are coming out pretty close, but depends on the industry as well. So lots of options there.
And something that's come up often is ensure whatever it is that you're using, that you're capturing the information you enter and those emissions estimates, because of course you want to look, since the focus is on reducing and change and addressing those emissions over time, you want to be able to look back at what you did the previous year, and you want to make sure that whatever free tool you're using is going to capture and keep that record for you so you can compare over time.
Yeah, definitely recommend.
An excellent point, Jennifer. Something that we didn't point out about this Qantas tool is you can actually extract that data in a spreadsheet. So when you get to your results page, you can download that and have that for future reference. So if you decide to start working with a consultant or doing it yourself, one of the most important things is having consistency year over year of how you go about your measurements. I think Pancho had mentioned, or no, it was a Chandos reference about what's excluded from your measurement and why it's excluded from your measurement. So just staying consistent with that year over year is really a best practice.
Thanks all, and thanks to those that are answering questions. I love to see the live answers throughout. I feel like we're all, I've even learned a bit from what we've been talking through today. Just to shift gears, we've talked about reductions in measurement. I wanted to also talk about insetting and offsetting briefly, and see if some of our consumer goods companies, if you have any stories to share of offset projects or regenerative projects that you've worked on that have also had that climate justice lens that have been particularly memorable. So Kevin, Eileen, or Pancho, anything jump out? And all are welcome to contribute.
Sure. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't, again, regenerative organic agriculture, which is ties in the best, we think, of organic and fair trade principles, and also animal welfare. That's the criteria of regenerative organic agriculture. For those of you who don't know what that is, it is a focus on healthy soils and intercropping, and it helps, the idea is that regenerative ag can help sequester carbon through intercropping and again, I mentioned that it incorporates fair trade practices. We believe that we need to pay fair wages to those along our supply chains and partner with our suppliers that grow our raw materials. So that's sort of the Dr. Bronner's principle, and we think all companies should be focusing on that.
Kevin, can you say which are some of the commodities or ingredients where you have Regen Organic up and running?
Sure. Our main one would be coconut oil. We have coconut oil from Samoa. I would say also palm oil and palm kernel oil. And I know palm oil is a controversial topic or crop, but we like to say that it's not the crop that is necessarily bad, it's the practices. And that's why, and I know there are some practices, organizations out there like the RSPO that have been trying to help folks with better growing practices with palm oil, for example. But yeah, I mean, yeah, again, crops themselves aren't bad. We have to look at the practices, and that's why we've engaged in regenerative organic agriculture. And also our mint oils, of course. We have a sister project in India where we grow our mint, Pavitra mint. And again, I mentioned sort of that fair trade premium. We see that as part of regenerative organic agriculture, and that premium goes to the community. They decide what projects they want to come out of the funds. We don't dictate to them how they use those extra funds that we get, that we impose on ourselves with the fair trade premiums. So those are ways we are trying to work on climate action and also build in climate justice as well along our supply chains.
I can also add, I think, Mike, you were asking also a bit about like kind of like insetting versus offsetting. And, you know, of course, we've talked a lot about measurement on this call, and several people have said this, but like the ultimate goal of all of this is to drive reductions and find those big areas and opportunities to drive reductions in our direct operations and in our supply chain. And at Allbirds right now, we are we fully offset all of our emissions. And so one thing that we do is when we do purchase offsets, we are always looking at you know, not just like, great, this is a project that exists and let's offset it, but looking at what, you know, what is the impact on those communities, what is the impact on people for these projects, and then of course also ensuring that it's you know, verifiable, permanent, all of the best industry standards around offset projects. But that's also with the ultimate goal of like really wanting to drive reductions in our own supply chain, or as close to our supply chain as possible. And so that's certainly a huge focus area of you know, not just saying we're emitting here and we can fix it from a different project somewhere else in the world. The ultimate goal is to really drive those reductions in our own supply chains as close to our business as possible.
Excellent. Yeah, sometimes always talk about knowing your farmer. I think it's good to know your offsetter and offset project intimately as well. So similar principle there, and highly recommend to the group. Kevin, your comment made me think of the new documentary Kiss the Ground, which is out on Netflix now, that is truly an inspiring and entertaining overview of regenerative agriculture. So highly recommend that to the group. And if one of our folks could help share a link to that, that'd be great. All right, let's see if we had any other questions here. We won't be able to get to all of them, but let's maybe have one more question, since I like to give folks breathing room for the next meeting. So I think on the scope 3 question around, there's a question from Viviana around potential for double counting if we're including our subcontractors. Anyone like to briefly cover that question?
I'd be happy to take it unless someone else wants it. All right. So yeah, certainly there would be double counting if you and your supplier are both counting your emissions, but that really doesn't matter. I mean, countries do a country level inventory, and technically that's double counting. Consumers might calculate their own carbon footprint, and that would be double counting. What really matters is the philosophy of what gets measured gets managed. So if you're accounting for everyone's emissions in your upstream, downstream supply chain, it gives you visibility into it and allows you to start, managing it. Now, if upstream suppliers offset their emissions, then you could technically claim that the emissions in your upstream, portion of your scope 3 from that supplier are neutral. You don't necessarily want to double count that. And that means that you need to offset less in order for your scope 1, 2, and 3 to be climate neutral or net zero or whichever approach you're going for. So yeah, certainly there's lots of double counting in scope 3, but that doesn't matter, because what really matters is that we act on climate and we do it as soon as possible, and we do it collectively. So the more people we can get involved, the more businesses we can get involved, measuring and managing, the better.
And I can share a data point that we have. I think last time we checked, there's about 11% of B Corps, or 20% of B Corps have a baseline, and then 11% have offset from our data set. So until then, I think it might be good to err on the safe side and offset for 9 of our neighbors, until we see movement in the parts per million, which even with COVID is still rising pretty fast worldwide. So even with the 5% drop from COVID, our parts per million, I think I last checked, was about 417 or so globally. And 350 is generally what we're aiming for. So we're kind of still have to flatten the curve, if you will, on this. And I think, as we hopefully get our COVID cases to 0 here, this curve and the climate curve, I hope that we all put the same effort into flattening the parts per million of climate. This is a big turning point as we enter out of COVID, to see if we can take the path to a low emissions future. So I encourage everyone on this call to try and be a part of that movement and hold our public leaders accountable to taking the path of a decline in emissions, since there's a lot of work to be done. I'll end us with just a paraphrase from Greta Thunberg, our fearless climate leader. She is encouraging all leaders not to just have a 2030 plan, but to have an April 2021 plan, and a May 2021 plan, and an annual plan thereafter, so that we're taking action tomorrow to offset our own emissions, reduce our emissions, and overcome from those that haven't taken action yet. So I'll leave our group with that. And I really want to thank all the amazing questions and all the group that was hanging in here. We had a really solid group for our Q&A. Appreciate all the preparations from our presenters. And yes, thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll definitely follow up with an email with all of the links, and then a follow up with the recording from this, so you can reference back to it. And we look forward to seeing that data rise as I track it in our B impact assessment, as everyone recertifies that are B Corps. Can't wait to see the increase in measurement here. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and hopefully we'll see these names in the next many years as we're all on this journey up the mountain together. Have a good day, everybody, and we'll have our contact info, and you can be put in touch with any of the coaches or presenters on the call. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.